So, we've had a day where people have been talking about everything from Humpty Dumpty capitalism to different forms of breakthrough innovation. And I think the tough questions now are, who's going to pay for this? How might it be done? Who do people need to do what? But let me just very quickly introduce Jamie Arbib. Some of you will know him already, founder and chairman of Tellus Mater or Tellus Mater.
You take your pick, John.
But basically, as Kelly has already said, the mission at Tellus Mater is to invest. There, I took my pick. Is to invest in game-changing ideas. And just to start us off, I wonder whether you could say a little bit about the process of review that you've just gone through, because you talk to a lot of people. You tried to think your way around this landscape. What sort of conclusions broadly have you drawn from that process?
Well, I mean, I'll take a step back if I could,
please,
John, and just, I mean, I sort of got involved in this whole space, I mean, maybe 10 years ago as an investor in clean technology, and the reason I set up Tellus Mater was that
is this me?
You know, I saw in a number of businesses that I was involved with, I'm not entirely sure that's any better, is it?
It is. It sounds a bit better.
A number of the businesses I had I just had huge frustration about getting what seemed to be almost no-brainer kind of energy efficiency type technologies to market and to getting them to scale. And it just struck me that you know, with the resource constraints that the world was going to be looking at, you know, energy in particular, but as China developed and you know, the developing world sort of came up to first world consumption patterns, that you know, if we didn't sort out some of these obstacles pretty quickly, you know, we were going to have a big problem. So I set up Tellus Mater really to try and attack some of those obstacles, and we went through a review after our first 3-year period over a sort of 6-month period over Christmas and the beginning of this year. And really, I think, you know, what came out of it, having spoken to a lot of people, was that we really felt that the top-down approach was broken, that certainly for the next few years, the idea that government's going to solve the problem through smart legislation or fiscal policy is just wishful thinking. And if we sit and wait for that, you know, we're going to be, you know, fiddling while Rome burns. But, you know, really, we see, you know, civil society and business as really the key drivers of change here. And that you know, there are a lot of, you know, interesting technologies there. There are a lot of businesses that are doing some interesting things, and it really is just a case of trying to, you know, our focus now is really on trying to cut some of these sort of pressure points. I think you called them acupuncture points earlier on, where we can really, for a small amount of effort, make a big difference and remove some of these obstacles. And I'm confident that you know, with enough you know, effort and enough firepower, you can find your way through it. And I think, you know, there's certainly hope for the future there.
Well, one of the things I've been finding myself thinking today, just looking out on this sea of faces, is just, it would be wonderful to have hovering over us a sort of a digital version of Marshall Clemens' maps earlier on this morning, just to see where some of those acupuncture or acupressure points might be. But just to pick up the point that was also made by Jeremy Leggett, the sheer volatility in clean tech markets, which, Jamie, you've referenced. David, if you think about biotechnology, I mean, that's been a brutal market for quite some time as well. I'm not sure that clean tech is actually seeing anything different than what you see in the evolution of any raft of new technologies. But I don't know whether you have any insights to draw from the biotechnology world across to sort of perhaps encourage Jamie to feel, and Jeremy and others, to sort of stick with it.
Yes, I mean, biotech goes through the classic sort of cycles of all new technologies. And we've had some pretty terrible initial over-enthusiasms when companies have been valued at nonsense prices, and surprisingly, lots of people have lost a lot of money. And that's set back the industry quite dramatically. What's changing in biotech, which may be going to happen in clean tech, although it's a slightly different industry, and I think it's very, very good, but it's long term, is that whereas 5, 10 years ago in biotech, the biotech company did its thing, Big Pharma did their thing, government did their thing, and they kind of didn't coalesce. They were like Venn diagrams, and there was no join at all. Everybody's realized that because of the attrition rate in drugs, where you can put 100 into people and about 1 comes out really sort of a serious major blockbuster, and the cost of going from one end to the other is probably now about $1 billion, that you can't do that if everybody's Venn diagram is just not joined together. And that's changing. And I think that joined up, very cooperative model, which we're pursuing, a lot of people are, is the way of the future. Now, it's slightly different in your industry because in a way, in theory, you haven't got the industry giants now, but you have actually. They're different companies doing different things. And maybe if you can get a more cooperative government, VC, money, small company, big company who wants to use your technology in some way, a more cooperative model. And I think in some ways you're probably more cooperative than we are already, but even more cooperative. I think that's the way to actually make it work. Share the risk, basically, is what I'm saying.
I'll come on to Colin in a second, because you recently had a very interesting meeting of investors, I think, in Los Angeles, and your reading of the sort of mood in that world would be welcome. But Caroline, if you think about your world of social investment, social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and so on, do you see any signs of the same sort of boom and bust cycle, or is it too little money or too much money? Where are we in all of this?
No. Does that work?
That's working.
Yes.
That's working.
I think it's too early to say, but what I would say is that what we want to try and do is avoid that in this
So
new
how would you do
emerging
that?
market. Well, I think there are two structural issues, fundamental issues around the use of finance and whether it's for environmental purposes or social purposes. And one is that we've stopped seeing finance as a utility. It's become a thing. And financial engineering has become more important than what happens to the money actually before, what happens to money? What difference does it make when it hits the ground? What is that money doing? That is much, much more important, and much more effort should be focused on that rather than this sort of engineering and structuring of finance, which should just be a utility. It should be cheap, efficient, and the most straightforward way to get money through is the best form of finance.
And there's been a lot of talk in recent years of impact investment. I mean, is this like a sort of a multicolored ball that the sea lions are going to play with for a while and then lose interest in? Or is this going somewhere?
No, I think impact says what it is. The issue is not what the finance is. What difference does the finance make? What is that money actually being used for? And the second thing, I think, the other structural issue is this issue of remuneration again, where the assumption being that the finance function is somehow the most talented and the best and most deserving of taking a huge slice of that money as it goes through. Again, I compared to social entrepreneurship or massive innovation and design and technology, why should that be the case? And I think, the concept of making personal financial motivation a key integral part of custodianship of other people's money seems to me slightly extraordinarily, an extraordinary model. So I think, impact investing is all about changing those preconceptions around the role of finance in the movement of capital and how to make that most efficient and most impactful for the benefit of society.
And Colin, in addition to the meeting that you had recently, you and David Blood and Al Gore talk about sustainable capitalism and sustainable investment. Many people still think of sustainability as largely an environmental agenda. Are you largely focused on environment, or are you also getting into some of the wider social spaces as well?
Yes, so many of you may know, but Generation has two main investment funds. One is called the Global Equity Fund, which is In our language, a long-only public equity fund, which basically invests across all sectors. And the way to think about that fund is that it's focused on long-term sustainability. So basically, what we look at investing in that fund are really businesses that we think are, future-proof, essentially. Yeah. So that could be, a healthcare company or a financial services company or whatever it is. And our research really looks at what are the long-term success factors within that industry, and do we believe they're going to be resilient over the long term. The second fund is called the Climate Solutions Fund, which is the one that I'm responsible for, which, as the name suggests, invests in more traditional climate-related, clean tech-related sectors. And that is obviously, very deep on environment, but also on other issues. We would probably draw the line at healthcare per se, but we would probably focus on healthy living as one way of sort of living a more sustainable way and low-impact way. If I could just make a couple of comments based on what was said earlier. I think we shouldn't forget that corporates are major players in the clean tech space. Capital comes from investment funds like mine, but it also comes increasingly from corporations. And I think what has been very interesting, if you look at the volatility of the clean tech space over the last few years, there's an index that tracks listed companies in clean tech called the NEX. That's down about 70% since 2008. Now, what that does is it means that small companies that are part of that index, or companies that are part of that index, are very attractive acquisition targets for larger companies. And if you look at the amount of M&A that is going on in clean tech right now, it is pretty extensive. Last year there was about $40 billion of acquisitions in about 700 companies. So larger corporates are aligning their own product portfolios to a low-carbon future by buying up companies from people like me, which is a good thing for me, by the way. But I think it's important to understand that the balance sheets of large corporates are extremely robust right now. They have been hoarding cash. They don't, as we heard so articulately this morning, the rates of return that you get from government bonds right now are basically negative. So corporates who are sitting on a lot of cash, they don't know what to do with it. So as the extreme example is Apple, that has over $100 billion of cash. What the hell do you do with that number? So I think that's one thing. The other thing that I think is increasingly interesting is this sort of notion of to throw in another kind of version of capitalism, but state capitalism. In particular, in relation to the strategic nature of access to energy, access to food, access to water. So what we're seeing is a lot of these markets distorted by very low cost of capital, driven by countries essentially locking up strategic access to these resources. Now, what that means, in the extreme, is that when we compete to invest in a company or in accessing a deal with a sovereign wealth fund, for example, that has a different type of return requirement than I do, because I have to generate a certain financial return for my clients. If I'm competing with a government, essentially, who have a strategic mandate that says, just make sure we don't run out of food and energy and water, and buy all the technologies you can find that will help us secure that, that distorts markets. And basically, it has a very large bearing on the healthy functioning of the clean technology space. One final point, and I'll stop because I'm occupying a lot of time, is that I think in the first wave of clean tech investing, there was a lot of money going into essentially infrastructure, and it was being perceived as a venture investment. And that is has been proved to be very painful for a lot of people who really have been funding stuff that infrastructure investors should be funding. I think there's a whole wave of companies coming through right now, Recycle Bank being a shining example, and we're very proud investors in that company. Of relatively asset-light businesses that don't require a significant amount of capital to massively scale. Maybe they require tens of millions of dollars. They don't require hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think a lot of the early clean tech investments that were made actually do require much, much more capital than the venture capitalists thought in the first place.
Thank you. Can I just do one last round of questions or comments? So anybody got questions? This side seems to be particularly well endowed. then Suzanne. Can we start? So where are we starting? Okay, Suzanne.
Hi, Suzanne. Suzanne Beagle from Clearly So and Clearly Social Angels. No one talked about holding companies. We talked about long-termism,
Yeah.
the need for that, the need for different thinking about that. People haven't talked about alternative exits. No one talked about new models of funding, such as crowdfunding, or the roles of angels and foundations and family offices, although you mentioned it, Colin. So I'm wondering if the panel would have any comments on, pick one, choose something in that.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, that one will hang in the air, and please. Okay. Did anyone want to pick that up?
Well, I honestly think the world of financing is changing completely, and for the better. And to come back to, I think somebody's point here about engaging with people. And the danger is that we stop doing that, whether it's through technology, through finance, that we talk in these things a little bit like economists did, that everybody's rational, everybody behaves in a certain way. And I just don't think that's true anymore. And I think, finance will change because everybody here has a pension. Do you know what your pension's doing? Do you know how much you're being charged for your pension? And people are beginning to care. They're beginning to want to know what's happening and how it works. It's their money. And it's money that they spend, whether it's through a corporate or through what they buy, through what they invest in, and so the democratization of finance, I think, is going to happen, definitely. And I think we need to be prepared for that.
Jamie.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting what's going on in finance and what might happen there. I think we talked this morning a bit about, I think the phrase someone used was the crowd and the cloud. But this sort of idea that globalization goes local, that everyone can get involved at any level, and the microfinance type firms and the crowdfunding type operations. I mean, if they can reach reasonable scale, it becomes very, very interesting. And the banking model, whilst they look very powerful incumbents right now, I would be scared if I was sitting in their shoes. I think that whole industry is going to change dramatically, and we could see some very exciting times to come.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just the holding company point. Jochen Zeitz of Puma was mentioned earlier on today because of their environmental profit and loss approach. He also is on the board of PPR, a very big French, Paris-based holding company. It owns brands like Gucci, Balenciaga, Stella McCartney, all of these. And what they're thinking with those 15, no, I think it's over 20 brands, is starting to cascade that environmental profit and loss approach through those brands. So it can work. It's still relatively rare. But a couple of questions here.
It builds on the last question in many ways. I'm Penny Shepherd from Uxif. Imagine that you're 30. And imagine that you're a 30-year-old who can actually afford to save for retirement. I think retirement is somewhere between 70 and 75 at the moment. So you're saving in such a way that you're expecting to live on the money in 40 to 45 years' time. Where do you put it?
Good question. Sophia, and then Kelly, and then if I may draw a line under this, and then a final round of replies, if you would.
So mine is on very much the same theme, which is what is the role, both of the telesmata and generation probably, in both the advocacy to get people whose pensions are looking so gloomy at the moment mobilised around this issue, because I agree that there is potential for people to becoming much more actively involved in managing and understanding their own pensions, but I don't see it happening, and I think there's a huge potential there. And it's both in terms of the advocacy role, but also in terms of the products that they can then buy. Because actually, if you're not a high net worth individual at the moment, it's extremely difficult to find a sustainable fund that wants your money.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Kelly, hopefully.
If I may, mine is more of a comment really than a question, but it is in response to Suzanne. And I feel as though in my role as both director of TELUS Mater and working with Marmony, I have a really good insight into what I would recharacterize as the continuum of finance. And I use this terminology a lot, and I think that we start with philanthropic early stage venture philanthropy, and we move with investors and models along a continuum to get to financial first, not necessarily value-based investing. But between those two, there is tremendous amount of investment innovation, exits, and opportunities. And I see that very strongly in the panel, so I would just like to reflect that back. I see it in generation, both in terms of the investment company and the foundation. Big society capital is one of the most aspirational, inspirational, and challenging models I've ever seen. And I know that's going to be a conversation we're going to have for the next 10 years. Jamie, obviously, with our work in TELUS Mater. And then I think what's so interesting in terms of the innovation around problem solving and financial first value-based investing. I mean, healthcare, you can't get any more in the core of what makes society tick and around people. And I just think that I wanted to respond to that because yes, we didn't really talk about holding companies and exit strategies, but I do think that we see a very, very creative continuum that you're all part of. So that's my comment, and thank you.
Thank you. We've got a fairly hard stop in about 5 minutes, but I'm going to extend it just slightly. I'm told no, I can't, but I'm going to just a minute or two. David Christie, could you sidle up to the stage? And can I ask our panelists for any final thoughts? I mean, you've had questions around pensions. You've had comments around the sort of spectrum of activities. In a way, one way I might crystallize it, when you started, Jamie, 10 years ago, or whatever, or different of you at different timescales to get involved in these sorts of issues, presumably a lot of people you work with in the financial world thought you were completely clinically insane, deranged, weird, or whatever. Probably a lot of them still do. But do you see any trends there?
Can I start, actually? I wanted to also say that I completely agree with two things that Caroline said about the fact that private equity has, I think, been slightly missing the message. And at Apposite, we've tried to be slightly different in two respects. One, I completely agree that financial engineering as a way of making lots and lots of money is a very outdated concept, and I hope that it continues to be that. We use financial engineering only to make our investments fit the particular company we're trying to grow. We don't use excessive leverage, we don't do excessive buy and builds, we just grow companies. I think the other thing is out of date. And the second thing is that I think what's changing, and we're definitely changing at Apposite, is our mindset is not we're the financier of a company, but we're the owner. Temporarily, we're the owner of that company. And that gives you a completely different way of working. So it's not how can I screw more money out in the exit, etc. It's how can I grow the quality of this company and grow the company itself. And I think that mindset change, which also leads to some of the other things Caroline was talking about in terms of pay and who gets what and how much the management gets versus the financier, I think that is changing very much in the way that you've been talking about in this conference, and I think there's lots of hope on that.
Thank you. Jamie.
Very good. I mean, you asked on how the sort of environment's changed over
I partly cut across some very good questions from here, so if you feel minded to answer those as well, that
okay,
would be great too.
I'm going to go back to the retirement question because you know, one day I would, I guess, like to retire. I can't really imagine it just now, but you know, it's. You know, where would you invest your money if you were 30 and looking out? I mean, it's a very good question. It's you know, I know right now where I wouldn't invest my money. You know, government bonds. I mean, I think if you're investing over 40 years right now and you're taking a 1.5% return or something. I mean, you'd be crazy. You know, I think places like agriculture might become interesting again. I think you know, certainly some of the kinds of companies that I invest in and that are invested in by you know, the others on this panel, I think healthcare, I mean, that's a theme that's going to play out over 20, 30 years. I mean, I think that's you know, if you're taking a longer term view here, I mean, you know, energy efficiency, resource efficiency, healthcare, you know, these are the big themes. These are the things that companies. These are the big problems that have to be solved, and I think that's really where you probably want to be looking. I think don't lend your money to the government just now.
God help the government. Caroline.
30. Oh, the memories. I think we need to get pension funds to return to investing rather than dealing, and they're very different things. At the moment, I think pension funds deal in investments. They don't invest in companies. And I think that's what we need to get back to, so there is that sense of ownership, and there is that sense of value that's being created. And, you're right, corporates now are producing the best returns. They are, their credit ratings are good. They've got, they've got really substantial balance sheets. And if we could get more corporates working towards more of a social agenda, an environmental agenda, then I think that's where the future lies for investment.
Thank you. And just finally, Colin, I should just reinforce the point that you made earlier on today, which is that you were very complicit in starting this whole process. So at the end of this day, any reflections on what you've heard?
Well, I'll just comment on the pension fund thing, if I may, and leave the final word to you.
Oh, I thought I was going to subcontract that.
No, I don't want to steal your thunder, John, but I think there's a very interesting kind of breakdown at the highest level in terms of who owns the assets. So the pension funds are basically, they're representing each of us. And the problem is the trustees of those pension funds are typically kind of good old boys who don't understand investing very well. So what they do is they sort of rely on investment consultants to provide them with asset allocation models that are built by very clever kind of PhD mathematicians who work out asset liabilities over a very long period of time. Often, the returns that are then required by the pension fund don't fully reflect the sustainability challenges that we all know well. So pension funds' fundamental return targets are the equivalent kind of stranded assets in a way that they're not really thinking about the full pricing of what we think the world's going to need to price. So the challenge for the investment consultants is that the way they get paid is by doing manager reviews. So essentially what happens is a pension fund board of trustees says to Mercer or Watson Wyatt or one of these investment consultants, go and find us some asset managers that can basically deliver us the return that you say we need. And so Mercer kind of does that, and they do lots of manager reviews, and they get paid to do that. So they put in place an investment strategy with maybe 20 or 30 asset managers that will deliver that return for the pension fund. But then Mercer's not really getting paid anymore because, actually the way they get paid is to do another review. So what they then say is, okay, look, Mr. Pension Fund Trustee, what you actually need to do now, the world's changed 2 years later, we need to do another review, and therefore we need to think about actually turning over managers. So what that does down the chain at our level is it basically incentivizes us to generate short-term returns, which then pushes down onto the companies to say, generate short-term returns. So that's kind of like the trickle-down effect, if you like, from right up at the top, where the problem is that the pension funds are not run by serious investors. And so, Blood will basically, often talks about, the need to align incentives within the capital allocation process at the sort of investment to company level, but, it's equally as important to the asset owner level. I think just coming to all the way down to the question about what should you invest in for the long term, I think it all depends on, your risk return requirements for what your income needs to be. And, as Warren Buffett often says, the first rule of investing is don't lose money. The second rule is listen to the first rule.
Colin, thank you immensely. Just while David comes up on stage, can I just thank you, David, Jamie, Caroline, and Colin immensely for taking part in this panel. What David, I hope, is going to do is just introduce us to the website, because it's going to sound arrogant to say this, but my sense is this conversation is only just beginning. A lot of people in the room today have asked how they can be part of this going forward. One part of the answer is the website. Anthony and others have been slaving up there on the balcony. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been doing?
I can. So, good afternoon. I think it's me between you and drinks.
It's
so
actually
that's
between that and me having my throat sliced.
And then drinks.
Yes, and then drinks.
Good afternoon. David Christie, Innovation Arts and the Value Web. We've been working behind the scenes today to create what Casper earlier on this morning talked about, feedback loops. And our belief is that if we can create faster feedback loops, people who are important in the world, every one of us, everyone that has a decision-making responsibility or some influence across the big decisions that are being taken, will be able to make those decisions faster, be more nimble, and have more impact. So our role today has really been to help these conversations get taken forward. So we've got a website. We've been building it during the course of the day. You might already have seen elements of this website already when you were registering or just checking things through, but we do believe in having things that are kind of pretty much actionable straight away. So you've seen the amazing artwork that James, Michelle, and Mike have been creating over the course of today. That's already going to be up on the website, so you can check that this evening. You've got all high-res copies of all that sort of stuff coming through. So you've got the scribes. You'll have the presentations that will be up there by Thursday evening, and also the video clips of all of the speakers, so you can go back and peruse and reminisce, all that sort of stuff, of literally what's been said. So presentations, the speakers live, and then also this amazing artwork, the scribing that's been done. I think it's probably also safe to say that you should be looking back and see how this conversation has evolved, how we've got to this place. There are going to be some next steps. There is a prospectus that's being put forward. That'll be due out. We've got to digest all the content that's come out of this so far, but that will be due out in the weeks ahead. And watch this space. We're hoping that there will be more gatherings. We want to keep this conversation going forward. If you've got suggestions, let us know. We're happy to kind of help make this conversation happen and make it resonate across the world. I think there are some final little thank yous. I want to say thank you to James, Michelle, Keshi, who's been taking photos, Anthony, who's built the website, so that you guys can have all this so quickly. I think we should say a big thank you to John for making this happen also, and the whole Breakthrough Capital team.